I think we're live.
All right. Welcome to episode number 2 of the AronRa podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Paul Schmidt about fusion. That's right. That's about as much as I know about it. I know that you can make power from it, and I don't know much more. So Aaron and Paul are going to talk a lot about that. A few housekeeping things before we get started. In the last 2 weeks, about 20,000 people have either watched or listened to the AronRa podcast, and all we can do is say thanks to that. We are going to be starting to have a sponsor for every show. If you have a group or a company or you're just a person that would like to sponsor the show, please get in touch with me at marknebo@gmail.com. And once I get that, I'll get back to you about sponsoring. Paul is here. Hello, Paul.
Hi. I'm trying to get my audio worked out. Hang on a second.
That's all right. I'm just gonna keep with the beginning of the show. You can go on Twitter and send your questions for Paul or Aaron to #TheRamen. Last week we had quite a few questions come in, and I said that we would get to some of the better responses for the challenge that we had last week, which was, what is your response when someone says, why don't you just let me believe what I want to believe? So we have some of those to go through, and we'll go through with those later. But Aaron, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and Paul's relationship and what we'll be discussing today?
Well, I ran into Paul three times, I think, in Apostacon last year. I ran into him in Boston last year, and yeah, he was frequenting some of the events, and just interested in the flow of how the movement's working, and wanting to contribute his insights into any improvements in our network. And then he got involved in this power grid, and it was a brilliant thing when he told me that he was attempting to construct the power grid for the world. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. When he gave a description of it, I thought, people have got to hear this. And that, as I understand it, is his primary mission here. He just wants to get attention for the project, let people know that it's going on. As I understand that fusion reactors are being devised or planned by a number of different people, and many of them are taking different approaches, and none of them have 100% degree of confidence, including those that have substantial funds, like millions and millions of dollars dumped into them. I don't know that we have anything that has been proven to be the right answer yet. And Paul, of course, is hopeful that he might have that one. And his descriptions are brilliant, so I'm looking forward to that discussion. Paul, are you up to speed?
I think so. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, we can hear you. Sound good.
Okay, great. This headset works great. Well, first of all, I should say that I'm not the brain behind the fusion effort that I got involved with at all. It's a guy named Eric Lerner with a company called Lawrenceville Plasma Physics. I have read up a lot about it, and I understand it from a trivial standpoint, but I'm a software guy, so I understand engineering, but I am by no means a plasma physicist. And to address one of the things you said, you mentioned you don't know if this is the right way to do it. Nobody does. At this point, no method of producing fusion energy has been found. No one has ever gotten more energy out than they put in. Last year, I think the NIF pushed that they had gotten more energy out of a pellet, of a fuel pellet, than the pellet absorbed. But if you actually look at what they were doing, they were using a ton more energy in running the whole device than the amount of energy that came out of the pellet. They actually got a fairly small amount of energy out. What they were doing is they were playing with the math in order to make it look like their experiment worked better. But not to trivialize what NIF is doing, they're doing amazing science, but it's not going to be a practical power generation system. So I have no audio.
I could see you talking, Aaron. I can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, it's not just me then.
No, Yeah, there you go. I could
Yeah.
see you say something and then laugh, and that was it.
Yeah. Okay, so Paul, tell us how much energy is involved, and what is the fusion reactor supposed to do to generate that energy?
Okay, so there are different approaches. The Lawrenceville Plasma Physics approach uses a device called a focus fusion, or actually it's technically called a dense plasma focus. They call their device FOFU-1 for Focus Fusion 1. It's the first version, and essentially what it does, it's going to be kind of hard to describe it visually, but if you go to the site, you can see diagrams and they have animations of how this works. It uses arcs of electricity from these pins in an electrode, and it runs these arcs up the pins, and they converge on each other into a point. And so they're running an enormous amount of electrical current through these arcs, and when they all converge, they start to twist up and they knot up into a point. And the electrical current that's running through those arcs causes a pinching effect that actually compresses anything that's in that area, as in the gas, the fuel gas that's in the device. It compresses it down, heats it up, and it causes fusion. The temperatures they're dealing with when they do this right now, they've already gotten 1.8 billion degrees, which is about 200 times hotter than the core of the sun. So that's
okay. I just want to mull that over for a moment. You've managed to generate temperatures 200 degrees hotter
200 times
than
hotter.
the core of the sun. 200 times hotter.
Yeah.
Than the core of the sun.
Right,
and you said an enormous amount of electricity. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me restate what I said earlier. I'm not doing the experiment. The experiments. My relationship to Lawrenceville Plasma Physics is I'm an investor. I talk to the guys there. I've helped them through some things having to do with their network. But I'm definitely not an official representative of Lawrenceville Plasma Physics. My interest in the project is to help them in any way I can. I invested in it, and I want to see it go. But so nothing I say is an official statement. You know, I don't want to get them in trouble.
No, I understand. When you were talking about the website that people want to look at, it's just LawrencevillePlasmaPhysics.com, right?
I think you can go to LawrencevillePlasmaPhysics.com or just LP Physics, so LPPHYSICS.com.
In either case or whichever case, we'll have the links included seconds after this broadcast.
Okay. So where was I? Yeah, the amount of energy that is concentrated in this little point, it's just a few microns across, ends up generating a temperature of about 1.8 billion degrees, so 200 times hotter than the core of the sun. It only does this for a few nanoseconds, so it's an incredibly brief period of time. It is a huge amount of energy, and the experiments they're doing so far are using deuterium. So deuterium is a very, very weak fusion process compared to the boron 11 that they're going to be using in the future. And I'm sitting here wading through a sea of technical details and thinking, should I say that? In any case, they're about, as far as I understand, they're about 10,000x away from break even. So in other words, they have to achieve 10,000 times more energy out than they have currently done. That sounds like an enormous amount. It sounds like, wow, you're only 0.01% there or something. From a plasma physics standpoint, that's actually very, very close. As far as I understand, they may even be closer than NIF is, depending on how you do the math. And I should also specify that there's no direct way to compare NIF with the dense plasma focus device, from what I understand, because they're just different technologies. NIF uses lasers to compress things, and the DPF uses electrical arcs. It's a completely different method, so you can't do direct math to compare them. But in any case, yeah. So they end up compressing this little dot, and the gas in this space that the dot's going to be compressed in contains a very light mixture of boron 11 and hydrogen. When it gets very, very hot, it becomes a plasma, so the electrons no longer adhere to each nucleus. So you have electrons and nuclei flying around in this soup. Okay, and then the whole thing gets compressed down to where the nuclei start colliding with each other, and that's when they join together momentarily, and then they blow apart into what ends up being 3 helium atoms. So you start off with a hydrogen atom, or a hydrogen nucleus, which is a proton, and a boron 11 nucleus, which is a bunch of protons and neutrons. They stick together, and you end up with 3 helium atoms, which are 2 protons, 2 neutrons each. Okay, that blasting apart process is what generates all the output power.
So we got a question already on Twitter, and this may be jumping way ahead, but they asked it now, so we'll ask it, and maybe we'll get to it. Atheist Analysis on Twitter is asking, what does the future look like? I mean, if this works, like, what can we be realistically looking at, and how far down the road is that kind of thing?
I think before we can even get to that answer, there's more in the explanation that we haven't got yet. And let's hear the rest of the full explanation about how this works and what it does.
Everybody's very excited.
And then we'll get to that question. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Briefly, it'll be weird, but we'll get to that. Okay, so to give you a general overview of what LPP is trying to do, the design that Eric's come up with, and he's got patents on it, and go to the site and read up about it. I read for about 4 months before I decided to invest, and I read everything I could about it, and I'm sitting here thinking to myself, is this really possible? And the conclusion I came to is, well, it may not be possible, but it's the closest thing I've ever seen to something that's doable. In any case, his target is a device that would be about the size of a shipping container, that would generate about 5 megawatts, which will power around 2,000 to 3,000 households. There's no radioactive input, there's no radioactive output, and this thing just sits there and generates power 24/7.
Okay, so we're talking about a micron, 3 microns of width, I think it was, and how do we have a plasma? For those that don't understand, the plasma is the 4th state of matter. Extreme heat, hotter than any gas could be. So yeah, there's a 4th state of matter there. So how do you contain plasma?
Well, the way the device is set up is that point that's going to be compressed is actually sitting just in an open area space with nothing but gas in it. So there's no solid near it. The nearest solid is maybe a half an inch away. Okay, so you have this very, very low pressure gas, maybe between 1/20th and 1/10th of an atmosphere of boron and hydrogen, and there's an electrode around it. It's a cylinder. It's an anode. I think it's the anode. I always get the cathode and anode confused, but there's a cylinder, and the way these arcs come around it is they meet in the middle, and this point is kind of right in the middle of the end of that anode. So that point that's just a few microns across is going to get extraordinarily hot in the gas. Now, the anode that's maybe a half an inch away isn't going to get as hot, but it's still a tremendous amount of energy. Okay, so when that very, very short, several nanoseconds, maybe 5 or 10 nanoseconds worth of a pulse of energy happens, everything inside that device is going to absorb a huge amount of energy. Okay, if you were to do that constantly without cooling the device, it would just vaporize and melt it. So what's going to end up happening is all of the parts inside this thing are going to have channels in them, and they're probably going to have liquid helium being forced through them at very high speeds to carry the heat away. Okay.
Now, judging by the fact that you've so far measured everything in microns and nanoseconds and so forth, when you say, and of course, a couple billion times hotter than the core of the sun, when you say very high or very low or very fast, we have to understand that you're saying very 52 times. It's very to the 10th power.
Yeah. Well, let me clarify. It's 200 times hotter than the core of the sun. It's 1.8 billion degrees. That's the temperature of the inside of that point. As you move away from that, the temperature drops down very, very quickly. But you're dealing with numbers that are so huge. There, I'm using the word "very" again. Start adding or dropping zeros. I think, from my understanding, I think the ambient temperature inside, the ambient gas temperature inside that device is on the order of hundreds of degrees Celsius. It's partially because the gas is being circulated, and there's all of the solids in the device are being cooled very, very fast. So they're actually kept down to a relatively cool temperature. The way the device generates electricity as if it were a steady state thing is it's doing this zapping process about 200 times a second. So it isn't continuous in that it generates the output energy in pulses. So you have a huge amount of energy in, a larger amount of energy out, but then that whole process is happening 200 times a second. So once you get done putting that
200
through,
times, 200 times every second.
right? That's the target. It may end up being 100 times a second. It may end up being 300 times a second. They're not sure because they have to get it to generate a pulse that generates more output power first. Then you figure out how do we make this thing actually, do this enough times a second that it's a viable power source.
Okay, so on some of the other attempts that are being funded, because we had a conversation on this topic with Lawrence Krauss a week or two ago, and he was talking about another organization that was being heavily funded that maybe they had a chance of success, but it didn't look like anybody had a real strong,
right.
That anybody's super confident that theirs is the right way. How do you compare your method or this method to some of these others or any of these others?
The one Lawrence is talking about is probably ITER, or ITER, depending on how you pronounce it. It's ITER. It's the project in France that I believe has about $20 billion in funding. There's a whole slew of countries that have pitched in money to help fund it. It's a 20-story tall structure. I mean, imagine a 20-story tall cube with some of the most sophisticated, expensive components inside. It is a massive machine. The ITER project will not generate electricity. It's not expected to. I don't even know if it's expected to hit break even. It's expected to advance the science so that they have a better idea of what they need to do so that a tokamak can generate electricity. Originally, it was supposed to break even, and I think now they're dubious about whether or not it can even break even. One of the guys who actually started the ITER project, if I'm not mistaken, gave a talk late last year in Japan, and just came right out publicly and said tokamaks will never be a viable energy generation source because they're too big and too expensive.
But now there's also there's people giving criticisms across the board for everybody's method, and you've had some of that yourself. So tell me about that, if you would.
Well, there are several approaches. There's the IEC, which is inertial confinement, what they call a polywell device that was invented by a guy named Bussard, which is a really interesting device. The U.S. Navy funded it for years, and I think they just stopped funding it. It's a device that holds the plasma in with magnetic fields from all directions, and it has some really interesting properties, but it's also very, very hard to contain, and it's very, very hard to get the energy levels up high enough so that you get more energy out than you put in. So that's an interesting one. There's a company called Tri-Alpha that is doing I think it's called an inverse beta configuration, and I haven't looked into that I haven't looked into it enough to speak intelligently about it. There are a lot of physicists who think it can work, and they have, I think, $140 million in funding and a huge number of people working on it. But from my understanding, they've hit major roadblocks and they're kind of stalled out. Now, I don't know. Tri-Alpha is also very, very, very secretive. They don't tell anybody what's going on. LPP is exactly the opposite. They're very open. They tell everybody everything they're doing, and that's kind of part of their defense mechanism because they have a patent on the device. So if they're successful, they don't have to worry about people stealing the ideas because they've patented it. So they want to be open about it all.
Yeah, when we spoke about this before, you talked about your the principal mind involved in all that sort of that is behind everything, and how the impression that the scientific community had of this person, and how that might be changing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the guy's name is Eric Lerner. I've met him. I've talked to him several times. He gets a lot of flack from the internet, or people observing, and one of the reasons is because a couple decades ago, I guess, he wrote a book called The Big Bang Never Happened, and when you read the title of the book and you think, oh my God, this guy's a Big Bang denier. Now, the interesting thing is, I actually have a copy of the book and I haven't read it yet, but I've had conversations with Eric about it and I've had conversations with other people about it. I kind of know where he's coming from. What Eric is saying is that there's a lot of evidence that flies in the face of the Big Bang theory. Things that, and he has many examples. Some of them have been shown to be, not credible. Some of them, though, are still up in the air, and they don't know what the hell's going on. Eric's point about the Big Bang is that the entire scientific community has pretty much decided the Big Bang is there. And Eric's argument is that's not good science. If you have evidence that could disprove the theory, shouldn't you be following up all of those pieces of evidence and see if you can disprove the theory? And so he takes a lot of flack for being a Big Bang denier. But let's just say that Eric does believe that the Big Bang just didn't happen, and he just completely doesn't believe in that theory. Does that mean he's wrong about this dense plasma focus device? No. Look at Newton. Newton believed in alchemy. He was sure right about a lot of things, though. And so when I look at the dense plasma focus project, regardless of Eric's other opinions, I look at it and I can't find any problems with it. I think it looks brilliant to me. It looks like a far better contender than anything else I've seen, including the tokamaks and including the IEC reactors and whatnot.
Okay, so you told me that despite earlier contentions against this guy's positions on other things, that related to the project at hand, that you were telling me that there was a number of people that are revisiting his ideas or changing their opinions with regard to this project.
I've seen some people, I mean, it doesn't happen a whole lot, but I've seen some people go on there and say, people will be having a conversation about the LPP effort, and then some guy will chime in and say, this guy can't be right. He doesn't even believe the Big Bang happened. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's a terrible physicist. And it's just such an immature, kind of ignorant way to go about it. Because he could be completely wrong about the Big Bang, but that says nothing about whether or not he's right about fusion. Another thing,
anybody?
Oh, go ahead.
Is there anybody that says he is right about fusion?
Yeah, there was a working group last year for really well-known experts in plasma physics, and one of the guys used to be, I think, either the director or deputy director of one of the nuclear agencies for the U.S. Did essentially an overview of everything LPP is doing. They were allowed to go to the lab. They got to, basically they got free reign of it. They did their own research and they looked at it and analyzed it, and they produced a report. And the rules of them doing this was LPP could not influence what they said at all afterwards. So they got to be completely independent, completely free to say whatever they wanted. And they came back and said that based on their understanding and everything they'd seen about LPP, it warranted a much larger effort, a much larger set of investment, and what they were doing looked not only viable but very interesting. So
now, one other thing. Go ahead.
There are other groups too. I think there's 4 groups outside the U.S. now who have looked at what LPP is trying to do and done their own modeling of it and come to the same conclusion that they believe it's possible to do this.
Okay, earlier you mentioned that another group, a different group, was containing this plasma in a magnetic field. You mentioned this same thing with regard to LPP's method at one point, right? Are they using the same thing? Are they doing that?
They're fundamentally different and in a very interesting way. First, well, let me point out 3 different ways that you can do it, or that it could, in theory, be done. One is a tokamak. That's the one that the entire fusion effort for the last 30 years has been focused on. All of the funding has gone to the tokamaks. Okay, what a tokamak is you can visualize it like a donut. Okay, where you have electromagnets around the donut that force the plasma into this circle. Essentially, it's a circle in space in the middle of this donut. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to contain the plasma to hold it inside that region. Okay. The problem with plasmas is they're really hot. They have a ton of energy in them, and they don't want to do what you want them to do. Okay. So a tokamak is trying to contain the plasma, but everything, the harder you try to contain it, the more erratic it gets, and that's one of the biggest problems they have with tokamaks is the more you think you have it contained, then once in a while it just arcs to the outside and blows the side off the tokamak device. right? Now, the Polywell reactor isn't a donut. It's actually a series of magnets that are set up geometrically so that how can I explain this? If you can imagine a cube where you have 6 sides, right? If you were to put a donut-shaped magnet on each of those 6 sides, you would have a 6-sided polyhedron of magnets, okay? So that each magnet is an opposite polarity to the one next to it. And what this ends up doing is it causes this magnetic field that can pinch stuff in the middle. So they create what they call a virtual anode, so that electrons like to fly around in there, and they try to keep them from going outside of that device. I don't really understand the math behind it, but there's also a special effect that happens when the energy levels get high enough. It tends to shut that off so that nothing can get out of it. There's a thing called cusp confinement, where they're trying to prevent the electrons from flying outside of it through the cusps in that shape that it causes. Okay. In any case, you can see how deep this stuff gets. That's a different way of...
I gotta jump in.
Sure.
The reason that we're having you do this description rather than a physicist, and Krauss, by the way, said you should have a plasma physicist on the show to translate what you're saying. And I'm thinking, I could gather a number of physicists that might be adequate to respond or at least interpret what you're saying. But then if we were having 2 people talking plasma physics to each other, who in the audience is going to understand any of that? So I think it's better
what
that
you guys are talking about.
Hey,
I don't, clearly.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'm going to go look this stuff up later and report back.
There are people in this audience, or there are people that are listening to us who know way better than I do, and they know enough to know that I don't know what this guy's talking about. But I find it fascinating, and I don't want to have the conversation confined to our guest and a plasma physicist, which I think is what Krauss was suggesting. I would rather throw this description out on the web and then have the people who know, look into it themselves, and then they'll see what kind of conversation generates from that. Yeah. But there was one other thing, Paul. There was one other thing you mentioned about the magnetic fields and everything, and you mentioned the word quasar, and that's what really prompted my interest. So can you explain about that?
Yeah, where that comes from, it's a way to think of what they're doing. It isn't a precise description, and actually I think Eric would probably jump all over me for saying that, but Eric's background is as a cosmologist. He was doing a lot of research back, I think, about 30 or 35 years ago, studying the electromagnetic properties of quasars and distant, really high energy objects in space, trying to understand why quasars emit, pulses of energy, what's going on there. And so I without being an expert on his history, I think what happened is he got a very, very good understanding of how quasars work, and I think he even modeled one of the first really complete theories of that. And then later on, when he was working with the dense plasma focus device, he was able to tap that knowledge of how quasars work, and I think he realized that what's going on in the dense plasma focus is very, very similar. Because most people, I don't think, realize this, but when you have a lightning bolt that goes down from a cloud and hits the ground, right? That current, that electricity that's flowing through there, because it's flowing through there, it generates a magnetic field. And that magnetic field, because it's such high energy, actually pinches around that arc. You see the line going down to the ground. If it hits a pipe, for example, that's stuck in the ground, and you can actually see pictures of this on Wikipedia, because this is how they figured out that it happened back in the late 1800s, I believe, or no, actually late 1700s. In any case, if it hits a pipe, very often the pipe will actually get crushed. I mean, it looked like some giant went up to the pipe and went like this to it and just crushed it inwards, because there's so much electricity flowing through it. The magnetic field is so intense that it actually just bends the metal because of the electric force. Okay, what Eric's doing inside the dense plasma focus is he's putting a ton of electrical energy in all these separate filaments, and when the filaments go together, they twist around each other, and they cause a little ball, what they actually call a plasmoid. Okay, that ball has so much energy going through it that that electricity causes an electromagnetic pinch that pinches it together. That's the big difference between the dense plasma focus, a tokamak, and a polywell reactor. The tokamak and the polywell are using external magnetic fields to try to push the plasma and make it do what they want it to. With the dense plasma focus, because of the behavior of the electricity, it does that for you. So you don't have to try to confine it with a magnet. It does it itself.
Okay, so for the benefit of all those critics who are going to come in and tell you that you're using the wrong measurements because you said you're using a ton of electricity, obviously we know that electricity is not measured in tons. But and bear in mind that when he says a ton of electricity, what he really means is 11 jillion gigawatts.
Right, and actually it is possible to have a ton of electricity. I actually saw a dissertation where somebody calculated the weight of an electron. And anyway, I think that was on...
You described at one point when we were talking about this before, you were saying that this device was creating mini quasars. And have you revisited that and decided that that's not the best description?
That's probably not technically correct, okay? But it's an interesting way to think about it. It's a for a very small amount of time, a few billionths of a second, a few nanoseconds, it's creating an object that is compressing itself because of the electron flow that's flying around it. Okay, that's really, I think, the most innovative difference between the dense plasma focus device and all the other approaches to fusion, is that it doesn't try to fight the instabilities of the plasma. It has its own coherence because of how it's done.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. We have a device the size of a railroad car, which you're comparing to a Borg cube in France that's 20 stories tall.
Right.
But yours, the LPP, is just the size of a railway container, and it's generating something that colloquially akin to mini quasars, where the plasma is surrounded by all these donut magnets to hold it contained, and that these crash into each other and then explode backwards, and it's the explosion backwards that generates the power. Am I correct so far?
Actually, that's the second enormous innovation in the way that Eric's doing it. Okay. All of the other approaches, and I think it literally is all of the other. No, actually, Tri-Alpha. I think Tri-Alpha is trying to do a direct conversion to electricity also. But I don't know enough about it to speak about exactly how that would work. But the dense plasma focus will be able to convert the power directly into electricity with no heat process. Tokamaks and the IEC, the polywell reactors, would need to convert the energy that comes out of the fusion reaction into heat. So, for example, with the tokamak, you're essentially going to be heating water and then running steam turbines, which is exactly how a nuclear reactor works today. Okay, the problem with that is it's not very efficient. You lose an amazing amount of the energy in just heating the water and getting it through the pipes and then running a turbine and having a dynamo convert it into electricity. What the DPF device does is, remember, you've got those filaments going up and you get this little compression, the plasmoid happens, okay? Because of the way the dense plasma focus works, it shoots electrons one direction and ions the other, okay? The electrons are relatively harmless. The ions it actually goes down. The ions go down. You just shoot them through a coil, okay? Well, those ions are electricity. When you run them through a coil, the electrons in the coil will flow. And that's essentially how you get the electricity out of it.
Wait, make sure I understand. You're shooting the ions through a coil.
Right.
And how does that generate power?
As far as I understand it, remember, I'm not a physicist, so because there are two ways of capturing energy from that. Yeah, this stuff gets beyond me as far as capturing from that device. It's either, I think what it is the velocity of the ions will slow down when it goes through the coil because it will coerce the electrons in the coil to move. So it's essentially a high-tech transformer. That's the way Eric puts it. It's a high-tech transformer that when you shoot ions through it, you get electricity out. And it's a solid state device. There's no moving parts. There's no heat. There's no steam. You just get electricity out of it. Now, I should also add at this point that when they do get to boron fusion, boron, by the way, takes a lot of energy to fuse. It's kind of the holy to deuterium.
As compared to the okay.
Yeah, there's all sorts of different fusion reactions. One of the easiest to do is deuterium fusion, and then you step up, I think, by 4x in power. You go to deuterium and tritium will fuse. The problem with that is it's heavily radioactive. That's what most of the tokamaks are trying to do. It's very, very radioactive.
Would that be? I don't know, 16,000 times the core of the sun?
Well, boron. Well,
you said boron uses a really high amount of energy, and what you've been talking about so far is already what I would consider a really high amount of energy. So again, you're using the word vary in a way that
right. I think
like it needs an exponent.
I think deuterium is somewhere around 400 million degrees is what you need to fuse it. I think boron you need about 1.6 billion degrees. So to give you an idea of the different temperatures, but that doesn't tell you how much energy you get out, because what you get out is determined by which clods of protons and neutrons are splitting apart.
Okay, so I'm sorry, you're running these ions through a coil, and that's going directly to electricity because it already is electricity. Is there anything else interesting about how that's being harnessed or transported, or does it become conventional at that point?
It's electricity. It's going to have to go through switches and diodes to load a capacitor bank, but that's fairly academic at that point. If you can get that coil outputting power, then you've got the power. It's a fairly academic process. Excuse me?
The goal is 10,000 times the output as the input.
Well, the goal is to get more output than you put in. If you can get 1.01 times, you've done what they call break even. You've got net energy. That's the holy grail of fusion. Whoever does that first is far cooler than I.
So when it was mentioned, and I mentioned in one of the promotional things that I wrote for this show, that nobody knew if this method is going to work, but that actually applies to every method of fusion reactors. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, nobody knows of any of them.
Yeah, Eric with the DPF is actually one of the closest. The experiments they've already done, they're already one of the closest fusion projects ever. I think. Oh, go ahead.
How do we get to a testing point on this?
Well, okay. Let me finish up one thing about the generation of power, because there is one category of stuff that I've left out, and it has to do with boron fusion. When you get the energy levels up high enough and you start fusing boron, that process is going to generate an absolutely massive. See, I switched to massive instead of very. It's going to generate a massive amount of X-rays. Okay. And that's related to why they just did their crowdfunding thing and why they're going to have to switch to beryllium electrodes, because I believe the dense plasma focused device, which by the way has been around for 40 or 50 years, it's a very well understood device. Dealing with those X-rays is where you get the last 30% of the energy. I think they're expecting to get 70% out of that coil, and then 30% out of the X-rays. And the way they're going to do it is they're going to build a device that's never been built in practice. I think it's essentially a solar collector, but instead of collecting photons that are visible, it's collecting X-rays. And the big difference between that collector and a normal solar collector is a solar collector is only one set of layers that, a photon hits it and then it's opaque. Well, X-rays like to go through things. They'll go right through metal to some extent. So what you need is like 3,000 layers of solar collectors that are tuned for X-rays. So it's these really exotic X-ray detectors, and I've worked with them to come up with methods of how do you manufacture this beast. But it's hard. It's going to be really hard to manufacture, or at least it's going to be really hard to figure out how to manufacture it. Once you make it manufacturable, you'll be able to make these no problem, if you can do it. So getting that last 30%. You have to harness this massive X-ray burst that if it weren't shielded would just, vaporize you. So there's shielding problems for short-term radiation, which is, it only lasts like 9 hours, and then you're back down to background. So it isn't dangerous. It's not like, this thing can't melt down and hurt anybody from radiation. Okay, but then you've got huge amounts of X-ray.
It's protected against things like tsunamis.
Yeah, it's very easy. I mean, the easiest way to do that is just put the whole thing in a concrete container that if it moves around, it moves around, and if it ever moves, it just shuts itself down, and then you've just got a big concrete block. Basically, it's completely safe. If you compare it to any existing nuclear reactor, there's virtually no risk at all. I mean, the only thing risky is the electricity because somebody could get electrocuted.
Okay.
So.
And the shielding, as you said, the shielding is these 3,000 layers of solar
for the X-ray.
For X-ray.
Yeah, for the X-ray, that's almost all of the shielding you need. We'll probably do more just for safety reasons. I mean, I'm sure that if we get to the point of generating net fusion, first of all, everybody's going to look at it and go, "Holy moly, they did it! When can I have my Mr. Fusion?" But then you got to go through this process of making it manufacturable, and I'm sure that every government in the universe is going to want to know that this thing is absolutely safe, and I'm sure that it will be over-designed. Over-designing it by 2 or 3x is not a big deal because the device itself should be so cheap. And also, like for example, radiation shielding, you put 3 feet of water on all sides of it, and you're shielded. So those kind of issues for safety aren't that big of a deal. I think most of the problems they have having to do with safety and things like that are easier than ITER and all the other attempts because the device is so simple. It's a relatively small device, it's cheap to build.
Okay. And I got another question for you.
Aaron,
yeah, go ahead.
No, the first thing I had read about this was when the Indiegogo fundraising effort had started up, and I guess you guys had collected $180,000 via that. Do you have an update on like where the funding is now?
Well, the Indiegogo campaign ended. I know that they're still taking donations on the site. I haven't followed that much at all. I got involved a year and a half before that. I got involved in January of 2013, and I've worked with them on some other fundraising stuff, more conventional with just shareholders. But I know they got the 180 from Indiegogo, and they've probably gotten more donations. I don't know how much they've gotten in total. Now, remember, the Indiegogo campaign is not to fund the whole project. The Indiegogo campaign was just to fund beryllium electrodes. All of the tests they've done, all the physical tests they've done so far for the last many years have been using copper electrodes that are silver-plated. Okay. The problem with that is the copper and the silver are so soft that when the current that they're running through it blasts into the electrode, it actually blows atoms off the surface, and then those atoms get into the gas, which fouls the reaction in the plasmoid. So they can't get the yield out of the process because the gas has other stuff in it other than, in this case, deuterium is what they're using right now. So
it's hot enough to convert silver into steam.
Oh yeah, yeah. So what they've done in the short term, remember, the Indiegogo is for beryllium electrodes, and by the way, beryllium is rare, expensive, and exotic. So it's expensive. It's going to cost at least, I think, $200,000 just for one set of electrodes to test with, and that's before there's any plating on it or exotic treatment. But stepping back one step, what they're doing before they go to the beryllium electrodes is they've ordered and they're having machined right now a set of tungsten electrodes, which if you have any physics background with tungsten has the highest melting point of any metal. I think it melts at about, I'm probably going to get this wrong and somebody's going to say I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I think it melts at about 3,400 degrees Celsius. So the problem with tungsten is you can't just make a mold and then mold tungsten because there's no material that will hold it. It'll melt it because it has the highest melting point. So how the heck do you machine it? So anyway, there's a process called EDM machining, which I won't go into the details. It is possible to machine it. It's time consuming. It's expensive. You have to know what you're doing, and so they've been going through this long, arduous process working with these aerospace contractors to make a solid tungsten electrode. that is very expensive. It's not done yet. It's actually delayed. It was supposed to be done in July, and it's been delayed. I don't know how much it's been delayed, but that delay is delaying the next set of tests. Now, the next set of tests we do with the tungsten electrodes will prove one of Eric's theories, which is that the atoms from the silver and the copper that have been being blown off into the gas are a major contributor to why the power that's coming out of the test shots that they've been doing don't match his theory. So it should show that he's right about the reason why he's not getting as much power as he should be out of it. If his tests are correct, then the only steps they have left are far simpler than this step that they're doing right now with the tungsten.
Okay. See, my wedding ring is made of tungsten, and I like it because, as I understand it, is one of the heaviest metals.
Right.
And
it's probably a tungsten alloy. Yeah. It's probably a tungsten carbide alloy.
Right. So on the test that you're talking about doing, I mean, this is going to be the test to show whether this will work, whether there's a need to build this, whether you're going to generate interest out of this. When do we know that? This will be the moment that tells you whether this is going to work or not, right?
As far as I understand, the single biggest unknown about the tungsten electrodes. First, we need the tungsten electrodes done. Then it's a matter of very carefully assembling the machines, making sure there's no impurities inside the vacuum chamber and all that, and then you just run test shots, and they should immediately see the difference in power output. So once they have the electrode, it should be a matter of weeks before there's some sort of result. Now, they may choose to hold off publishing it if the result is really good, because this test coming up is, I think about it at least, as the big kahuna of the tests, because I think they have 3 different things that they want to do after the tests, but those things are all extremely well understood for that device. And so if I'm not mistaken, there's 4 steps. The tungsten electrodes are the first one, and then there's 3 other steps they need to take. These 3 are very, very well understood. The tungsten test, though, is the first time anybody's tried to apply tungsten this way in this kind of device to solve the problem that he's trying to solve. And if that problem is solved, at least as good as he says, I think he needs 50x out of it, but I think he believes that a lot more will happen. I think he believes it could be as high as 100x. Okay? Well, that makes all these other 3 steps even easier.
I just want to get an idea of the ballpark estimate on when it will be known, or when it could be known, that this will actually work.
Right. It all depends on the machining. And right now I don't know if they have a hard date. I know that they had a vendor picked out, and we had a hard date that I think was end of June, and then that slipped a few weeks, and then the vendor came back and said, we have all these serious problems, and I don't know if they had to switch vendors or not, but they had these serious machining problems. The reason is because machining pure tungsten is really, really, really hard.
Okay, so let me change speed a little bit and discuss why it is that we need to do something like that. Because I live in Texas, and people here are completely happy to go frack the environment. I mean, we just dig another oil well, and and you're done. We've got plenty of coal, right? We just pipe it in from Canada or wherever, and we're good to go. We can continue on fossil fuels. I heard this conversation yesterday that the fossil fuel industry will never peter out, that we are always going to be able to rely on fossil fuels just as plentifully as we do today. I heard that conversation yesterday.
That saddens me.
How do you address that?
I can think of 2 problems with fossil fuels right off the top of my head. I mean, the process of using fossil fuels just destroys the environment. I mean, it's just the whole green argument, the climate change and all that. I mean, if you keep using fossil fuels, we're going to have a problem. As far as I know, the only technologies we have to sequester CO2 out of the atmosphere require an enormous amount of electrical energy. So you would need something like fusion to get rid of the CO2 that the fossil fuels are creating, because if you use fossil fuels to generate the electricity, you're putting more CO2 in the air than you're taking out. So,
let me explain why I'm concerned about this. I mean, I understand that the plastics, we're going to want to continue to build plastics. Okay, granted, we have, as I mentioned to you before, we have jets. Jets are, a very efficient way of traveling. And we have, for automobiles, we have all manner of other means of propulsion, including dead-out electric off of batteries.
Right.
So it strikes me that we had all these fossil fuels, we had these oil reserves that have been around way longer than us. And in the span of little more than a century, we've consumed so much that the petroleum geologists that I know have been telling me that we're running out, that they're finding fewer and fewer places where there's any reserves at all, and that we're having to go to other methods, for different types that aren't as productive or as good or as fine as what we originally had, because the resources are limited, they're running out. So
that's the second reason. It's a finite resource.
Yeah. So in the span of a century, we're going to burn out everything we've got. And we know that currently we have jets that can only use fossil fuels to fly. There's no other way. There's no other means of propulsion to get a 777, a Boeing 777, into the air at 600 miles an hour, across the ocean to New Zealand. There's no other way to do that. We can use other means for powering cars, for powering houses, and so on. Why do we have to waste all of this to the point where we can't fly anymore, on top of everything else we won't be able to do? To me, it is a massive lack of forethought. It's people who can't see past the next fiscal quarter.
I agree.
That bothers me.
I mean, even if we did have more oil left than we do, the species is growing, the per capita is growing, the per capita consumption is growing at the same time. And it's just a finite resource. It's a classic exponential growth curve against a finite resource problem. We're going to run out faster than we think we are, and the process of getting closer and closer to that run out point is going to just get expensive geometrically. So the quality of life at some point is going to go way down.
Anytime one of you science advocates start talking about how we're going to run out of resources or how we're going to have to change what I do Monday through Friday, well, then I get indignant. This is the way Texans are. This is the way all of the anti-environmentalists seem to be. Yeah. I'm going to keep driving my '69 Chevelle with the 454 and the dual quads, because I don't have to change anything that I'm doing.
Right.
Because it won't matter when all of this stuff's going to happen after I'm dead anyway, and to hell with my own grandchildren.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of on a related note, but kind of drifting off topic. So stop me if you don't want me to go there. I was thinking about this a year and a half ago when I got involved with the company. I was kind of afraid that the oil industry, if we proved that it was possible, that the oil industry would just, try to control it, pull whatever strings they could. You could have all sorts of weird conspiracy theories about things that could go on, but something that could be this damaging to the oil industry, you would think, well, they would make sure that doesn't happen. I don't think that'll happen anymore. The U.S. is consuming about double what it can produce in oil today. And what about in 5 years when we can't produce as much? I think the people in power know that they have to do something about power, and I'm pretty sure about 40% or so of U.S. energy consumption is taken up in transportation.
I know that in the mid '80s we had some very, very efficient all-electric car prototypes, and that these were all scrapped, and that all of the electric cars on the road in the United States were collected, confiscated, and impounded, buried, destroyed.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to produce those again. And for whatever reason I can't imagine, the electric cars we're coming up with now are not the high efficiency cars that were boasted in Popular Mechanics or whatever the magazine was, I can't remember, in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. I don't know why that is. I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I know that we had electric cars and the government shut that all down, and now they're permitting those to come back again.
Right.
Make of that what you will.
Yeah, I also think that even if they wanted to suppress this, it would be more difficult than usual. And part of the reason is because Eric has the patent, and Eric has announced everything he's been doing the whole time. There are thousands of people all over the world that is watching Eric Lerner do this. If Eric Lerner suddenly disappears, or this gets shelved, I'll bet you a whole bunch of research projects pop up in all sorts of different countries trying to replicate what he's done so far. Because the only reason other people aren't trying to compete with Eric is because he owns the patent. there's no monetary incentive to try to compete with him. Okay? But at the same time, he's disclosing everything about what he's doing to the world. And actually, he's encouraging criticism. That's another difference between him and every other fusion attempt. He's put everything out there. And I'll tell you, when I started reading about this maybe 7 years ago or so, when I got interested in the polywell reactors, everybody was calling Eric Lerner a whack job. I mean, they were just crediting him, saying he doesn't know what he's doing. He's crazy. Look at his hair. You know, the guy looks like a mad scientist. He really is.
That all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but you know what? Nobody is now. Nobody's criticizing him because he's got peer-reviewed papers. In 2012, he published a paper about the 1.8 billion degrees when they got that result. And in 2013, it was the most read paper in the journal Physics, which is the most popular plasma physics journal in the world. So he had the most popular paper in the most popular plasma physics journal in the world. And as far as I know, no one's challenged it at all. So if he's wrong about his theory, no plasma physicist is stepping up and saying so. There's a bunch of them.
I wanted to generate.
Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to generate conversation. Yeah, I want to see what the people who know this better than I do have to say about all this. It's going to be interesting to see it all come up. I, of course, would love to see it happen. I'd love to see it be successful. I'd love to see something that can lay challenge to the fossil fuel industry be an option.
Aaron, why don't we make the call to action for next week? Anybody that is watching this video or listening to the podcast later, whether you know anything about this stuff or not, why don't you make a response video on YouTube and title it Response to the Ramen and Paul. And when those start popping up on YouTube, we'll watch them. And if we like your video, we'll actually have you on one of the upcoming shows.
Okay, real quick, we had a question that we didn't answer because I jumped in the middle and said, no, let's answer it later.
Yes.
It's time to
Paul, what
that.
what is the future going to look like if this is successful, in your opinion?
The honest answer is I have no idea. But if I were to speculate, I think one of the big advantages that we haven't really talked about a lot is that because it's a small reactor, it's about the size of a garage, if you think about it. The natural way to deploy these is to put them all over the place and connect them together so that when one goes out, another one nearby can help feed power to it. And so that gives us an opportunity to rebuild the entire electrical grid so it's not this monolithic thing with these giant power plants that are, you know, sending power out in all directions. But instead you have this kind of smaller mesh overlaying everything. And it makes it incredibly resilient against attack. It makes it fault tolerant. It makes it much easier to deploy. It makes it much easier to manage. Makes it easier to maintain. Localizes everything. So that part of it is really interesting because that way you don't have to rebuild the grid that's already there. You can just put another grid right on top of it and ignore the existing grid. So that's part of it. The price, from what I understand, the price targets that they're trying to hit is about 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour maximum. The cheapest alternate form of power generation that I've heard about is about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So you're talking about more than a 20x difference. In other words, imagine electricity. Your electric bill goes down to 5% of what it is now. And of course, it won't do that. It'll go down to 10%. Everybody needs twice as much. But yeah. So those are the changes. What kinds of economic changes happen, or style of life changes happen? I have no idea. I mean, when you get into electric cars, and Elon Musk says this all the time, or at least he used to, if you take a gas car and drive it a mile and say how much gas does that take, and then you take an electric car and drive it a mile and say how much electricity does that take, it takes more than that amount of electricity to refine the first amount of gas. So the best way to power all the electric cars is to stop refining oil, and you'd have a surplus of electricity.
Right.
So and then we'd have a much longer production of plastic and fuel for aircraft.
Exactly. Now, I do want to make this point about the aircraft, and I'll do it very quickly. I'm not convinced that you can't use these reactors to power 747s and 777. I think it can be done. It would require slightly different. It would require some optimizations to the design, or they'd have to come out way ahead of where they think they're going to come out. But I actually think you can eliminate fossil fuels on the jets for large jets.
That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, that would be revolutionary because.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm blown away. I mean, I knew that I was going to be kind of behind the 8 ball with this. I'm excited to see if anybody puts up any videos. All the listeners and viewers, please respond. And as I said last week, when Matt Dillahunty and Aaron were on here, they were talking about the idea that religious people are sincere in their beliefs. They both took different sides, and one of the things that came up was they often say, why can't you just let me believe what I want to believe? And one of the responders on Twitter, Eric Bass, said, to me, it means that the person has no wish to pursue the truth. Make-believe is easier and more enveloping as a lifestyle. Truth is hard. That's true. To some of them, it's hard to grasp the truth. I agree with that.
Yeah, the truth
thanks
is
for listening
hard.
to the.
The truth is
right.
hard, cold, and inconvenient.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Paul. Aaron, who do we want to have on next week? Are we decided? Is it going to be DPR? I mean,
yeah,
2 weeks.
We're going to have DPR Jones. Yeah, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have DPR Jones on, and he's going to be talking about the upcoming charity telethon that he does for Doctors Without Borders, also known as Médecins Sans Frontières.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for listening and watching. Good night.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you much, Paul.
No problem.